Hey guys, thanks for tuning in. Tonight we're diving into the wildest, weirdest, and most jaw-dropping truths about the gladiators of ancient Rome. From the bizarre diets that kept them fighting, to the unexpected roles women played in the arena, to the shocking ways these warriors became celebrities. Get ready, because the history you thought you knew is about to be flipped on its head. And trust me, once you hear what we've uncovered, you'll never see the Colosseum the same way again. But before we get started, please consider giving this video a like and a subscribe. And without further ado, let's get started. Imagine stepping into an arena where the roar of 50,000 voices shakes the ground, where the air is thick with dust, sweat, and the metallic tang of blood. The sun blazes overhead, beating down on men whose lives balance on the edge of a blade. We think we know the gladiator, the fearless warrior, the bloodthirsty killer, the star of Rome's most brutal sport. But what if the truth was far stranger? What if these so-called warriors weren't always slaves? What if some chose the arena? What if the battles weren't always to the death, and the crowds weren't cheering for what you think they were? Becoming a gladiator in ancient Rome wasn't always the grim fate we imagine. Sure, plenty of fighters were forced into the arena, prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or enslaved people sold to gladiator schools. But here's the first twist. Some people, they signed up willingly. In fact, Roman citizens, free men with no chains around their ankles, could volunteer to fight. Why? Sometimes it was desperation, crushing debt, no job prospects, or a chance to escape disgrace. Other times, it was pure thrill-seeking, the intoxicating promise of fame, wealth, and the kind of glory usually reserved for generals and emperors. Once chosen, or sentenced, a prospective gladiator was sent to a ludus, the training school. This was no casual gym. The place was run like a military camp crossed with a prison. The man in charge, the lanista, he owned the fighters, he invested in them, and he expected a return. The first thing new recruits learned, they weren't stepping into a chaotic bloodbath. The arena was highly choreographed and demanded extreme skill. Training began with wooden swords, not steel, so fighters could master the form without losing fingers on day one. They drilled footwork, shield control, weapon handling, and even stage presence. Gladiators had to learn how to make a fight thrilling for the audience, to play up a hit, to drag out the drama. In many ways, they were part athlete, part actor, part showman. But here's the thing. It wasn't just combat training. Gladiators were fed a carefully managed diet, surprisingly heavy in barley and beans, designed to bulk them up and give them a layer of protective fat. This made wounds less deadly and created that thick, imposing look that the crowd loved. They also underwent intense medical care because, contrary to popular belief, the owners didn't want them dying too quickly. These fighters, they were valuable investments. And then, after weeks or even months of grueling preparation, the day would come. The gates of the arena would open, the blinding light of the sun would pour in, and the gladiators would step into the roar of the crowd to fight, to entertain, and perhaps to survive. But here's where the story of gladiators takes an even stranger turn. When we picture the arena, we imagine towering, muscle-bound men clashing with swords. Yet the Colosseum sands weren't reserved for men alone. Women, yes, women, also fought as gladiators. These female fighters were rare, but when they appeared, they were a sensation. Roman writers described them as both shocking and fascinating, part scandal, part spectacle. They weren't just dressed up stage acts either. They trained, fought, and bled, just like their male counterparts. In some cases, they even faced men in the arena. Their existence rattled traditional Roman values. This was a culture that expected women to remain modest, domestic, and far from the chaos of combat. So when a woman strode into the arena, armed and armored, she wasn't just fighting her opponent, she was defying the social order. The crowds loved it, the moralists hated it, and the emperors, well, they saw an opportunity to draw even bigger audiences. It's just one of those strange truths that flips our modern assumptions upside down, and it's far from the only one, because the more you dig into the world of gladiators, the more bizarre and unexpected it becomes. The truth is, the more you peek behind the curtain of the Colosseum, the stranger things get. And not quirky neighbor strange. We're talking, wait, did that really happen strange? Take gladiator diets, for example. You might imagine them feasting on meat, like ancient bodybuilders, gnawing on giant turkey legs before a match. But nope, most gladiators were basically ancient vegetarians. Their diet was heavy in barley, beans, and other plant-based foods. This earned them the nickname barley men. And here's the kicker. They drink a concoction made from vinegar and ashes. Yes, actual ashes. Supposedly it helped straighten their bones. Whether it worked or not, I can't say. But it sure would make a modern protein shake taste like fine dining. Then here's the whole every fight ends in death myth. Hollywood loves it, but the Romans weren't in the habit of throwing away expensive investments. Gladiators were costly to train and maintain, so owners tried to keep them alive. Sure, deaths happened, but many fights ended when one fighter was too injured or exhausted to continue. The famous thumbs up, thumbs down decision? Well, that's a little grayer than we think. It's possible it never happened the way the movies show. In other words, Russell Crowe, he might owe us an apology. And here's one that'll mess with your mental image. Gladiators weren't always big, tall, Hercules types. In fact, shorter fighters sometimes had an advantage. Smaller target, quicker movements, lower center of gravity. Imagine showing up to the Colosseum expecting a towering brute and getting someone built more like your cousin Macro, who then proceeds to absolutely wipe the floor with his opponent. Oh, and fame? Being a successful gladiator could turn you into a celebrity. We're talking murals, carvings, adoring fans, and yes, fan mail. Archaeologists have even found love notes scratched into the walls praising specific gladiators. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a thirsty Instagram comment section. By now it's clear. Gladiators weren't just brutal fighters in some dusty history book. They were athletes, showmen, oddballs, and sometimes total divas. And the reality of their world is way messier and way more fascinating than the clean-cut legends we've been fed. And just when you think you've heard it all, the Romans go and add blindfolds. Yes, in some matches, gladiators were deliberately blindfolded, usually as part of a special spectacle meant to amuse the crowd. Imagine trying to block a sword swing when you can't even see where it's coming from. It wasn't exactly fair combat, but fairness wasn't exactly the point. The audience loved the absurdity. It was part athletic skill test, part comedy act, and part, let's see what happens when we make this completely ridiculous. Think of it as the ancient Roman version of a reality TV stunt, except with higher stakes and way fewer safety regulations. And while we're on the subject of misconceptions, let's talk about the animals. Pop culture makes it look like gladiators spent half their careers fighting lions, tigers, and other exotic beasts. In truth, that was pretty rare for actual gladiators. Those dangerous matchups were usually reserved for venatores, specialized hunters trained for animal combat. Gladiators were too valuable to risk against a lion that didn't care about choreography. When animals did appear, it was often for grand spectacles, between the main events, like almost halftime entertainment, but with slightly more blood and significantly fewer marching bands. So the image of a gladiator wrestling a bear might make a great movie poster, but in reality, the pros stuck to fighting each other, The lions and leopards were left to the daredevils, who signed up for what was basically the deadliest side gig in history. In the early days, the Romans staged full-blown naval battles inside the arena, and they weren't just splashing around in kiddie pools. The Colosseum was specially engineered with an intricate system of channels and cisterns that could flood the arena floor with water deep enough to float scaled-down ships. Crews of fighters would then reenact famous sea battles, ramming vessels, boarding enemy decks, and sending actors or sometimes prisoners plunging into the water. The logistics, well, they were absolutely insane. They had to drain and refill the arena in a short time, keep the wooden ships from sinking too soon, and make sure the water didn't just turn the entire Colosseum into a muddy disaster. And this wasn't a permanent feature. Over time, the Romans phased it out as the arena floor was remodeled to accommodate more traditional gladiator games. Still, the fact that the most famous sports stadium in history was once a pop-up ocean, that's Rome for you. When regular entertainment isn't enough, flood the building and throw in some boats. And if flooding the Colosseum for mock sea battle sounds like the height of Roman extravagance, well, the emperors weren't done showing off yet. Sometimes they didn't just watch the games. They would become the main event. Several emperors, most infamously Commodus, actually stepped into the arena themselves. Now, before you picture the ruler of Rome in a fair fight, let's be clear. These weren't exactly balanced matchups. Commodus, for example, fought hundreds of times, but always under very controlled circumstances. His opponents were often armed with blunt weapons, or not armed at all. In one recorded event, he fought men with no legs. Another time, he killed animals from a safe platform, ensuring the danger was more show than reality. But to the crowds, it was a spectacle. Seeing the emperor fight, even in staged combat, was like watching a celebrity do something outrageous on live TV. But to the Roman elite, it was scandalous. The idea of an emperor lowering himself to the status of a common gladiator was an insult to the dignity of the throne, but he didn't care. He saw himself as a living god, often dressed as Hercules with a lion skin over his shoulders, basking in cheers of the masses. Of course, he wasn't the only ruler to blur the lines between emperor and entertainer. Others dabbled in arena performances, whether in stage hunts, choreographed duels, or ceremonial appearances. It was a risky PR move. Done right, it made them beloved by the public. Done wrong? Well, let's just say it didn't exactly help avoid a sticky end. But of course, not everyone who stepped into the arena did so with the swagger of an emperor. For the average gladiator, fighting wasn't always about glory. Sometimes it was just about survival. And here's the thing. What if a gladiator simply refused to fight? It did happen, though extremely rarely. The games were carefully staged, and the pressure to perform was enormous. A refusal could enrage the crowd, insult the sponsor of the games, and humiliate the lanista who owned the fighter. In some cases, the consequences were swift and brutal. Sometimes a gladiator who balked at combat could be flogged on the spot, forced into the fight anyway, or replaced with another who would. In more extreme cases, refusal meant execution, not in the shadows, but right there in the arena, as a public lesson in obedience. And remember, the Romans didn't just love a good fight, they loved a good story, a defiant gladiator who could be spun into a villain for the crowd to hate, the perfect foil for a heroic opponent. That meant the punishment often became part of the entertainment. Imagine tens of thousands of people booing you, not because you lost, but because you didn't give them a show. For most gladiators, there was motivation enough to step forward, lift the sword, and give the crowd what they came for. Because in the Colosseum, fighting wasn't always the most dangerous choice. Sometimes, refusing was. And if you think the danger ended when the fight was over, that's where Roman superstition takes things to a whole new level. The aftermath of a match could be just as bizarre as the fight itself. Victorious gladiators were showered with cheers, sometimes with gifts, and always with the eyes of the crowd on them. But for the defeated, especially those who died, their bodies often became part of a strange ritual economy. In ancient Rome, gladiator blood was considered magical. Some believed it carried the strength and vitality of the fallen warrior. Physicians, yes, actual doctors, sometimes prescribed drinking gladiator blood as a cure for epilepsy. It was thought that if you drank the blood of a gladiator, you would be transferring the fighter's power into the patient. Others saw it as a talisman of bravery. Archaeological evidence and written accounts suggest that after a match, attendants would collect the blood, sometimes still warm, and sell it to eager buyers. In some cases, they even scraped the sweat from a gladiator's skin and bottled it as a love potion. Yeah, ancient Rome basically had the world's first celebrity merch table, and it was deeply unsettling. To us, this might sound like the stuff of horror stories, but to Romans, it was just another part of the spectacle, a way to take a piece of the arena's power home with you. The Colosseum wasn't just a place to watch life and death struggles. It was a factory of myth, magic, and sometimes madness. And maybe that's the real secret of the gladiators. They weren't just fighters. They were symbols, stories, and living legends whose lives, and even whose deaths, fed the imagination of an empire. Long after the cheers faded and the sand was swept clean, the Romans still carried a piece of them, sometimes quite literally. But for every gladiator who bled in the arena, there were tens of thousands of eyes watching from above. And if you really want to understand the Colosseum, you can't just stand in the sand with the fighters. You have to climb the stone steps and take a seat among the roaring crowd. Because being a spectator in ancient Rome wasn't a passive experience. The Colosseum wasn't just a sports venue. It was a living, breathing theater of chaos, politics, and raw human emotion. From the moment you walked through those towering arches, you were stepping into a carefully engineered world, one that could thrill you, shock you, or even turn you into part of the story itself. So, what was it actually like to be there? To feel the stone tremble under the roar of 50,000 voices, to smell the mingling of perfumes, street food, and the iron scent of blood? Let's take a seat in the stands and find out. You wake up early, not because you're an early bird, but because if you want a good seat in the Colosseum, you have to beat the rush. The emperor might stroll in fashionably late, but you're elbowing your way through the crowd with a hunk of bread in one hand and your best "don't step on my tunic" face. The Colosseum looms ahead like a giant stone spaceship that's landed in the heart of Rome. You join the human river flowing through its arches, and immediately you're swept into a sensory overload. Vendors are everywhere, selling olives, sausages, pastries, and for the truly adventurous, questionable meat on a stick that may or may not be a pigeon. Perfumes and incense mix with the smell of sweat, leather, and just a hint of, is that lion? Yeah, that's definitely lion. Once inside, seating is a social statement. The wealthy and powerful get the best spots close to the action. Senators sit right at the front, probably pretending they're above all this while secretly loving every second of it. The higher up you go, the rougher the crowd gets. Merchants, farmers, travelers, and people who may or may not be wearing yesterday's toga. You've got your ticket, or a wooden ticket, and you find your spot among the masses. Then the games begin. Horns blare, the crowd roars, and the emperor appears in his box like a celebrity making a red carpet entrance. Opening acts might include animal hunts or exotic beast parades, elephants lumbering across the sand, leopards leaping from the cages, all to warm up the crowd. Between events, people gossip, eat, and place bets on who will win. The atmosphere is part football match, part rock concert, part blood-soaked soap opera. When the main gladiator fights start, the energy spikes. Every block, parry, and strike is met with shouts, cheers, and groans. You're not just watching, you're part of the action, part of the pressure that can decide whether a defeated fighter lives or dies. And while the games can last all day, you don't mind. There's drama, there's spectacle, and there's always the hope that today's match will be the one people are still talking about years from now. By the time you leave, the stone steps are warm from the sun, your ears are ringing, and your voice is hoarse from yelling. You've seen battles, animals, maybe even a mock sea fight, and you've eaten your weight in bread and olives. Tomorrow, Rome goes back to politics and trade. But today you are part of the greatest show on earth. One of the best kept secrets of being a Roman spectator, you didn't always leave the Colosseum empty-handed. In fact, depending on the day and the emperor's mood, you might walk out with more than just a hoarse voice and a sunburn. For starters, there were gifts, tokens, or even cash handed out to curry public favor. Sometimes these were little wooden discs, stamped with the image of the emperor, which could be exchanged for food, wine, or other goods. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a voucher code, except instead of typing it into a website, you traded it at the market while bragging that Caesar himself gave me this. Then there were the raffle prizes. Yep, the Romans loved a good giveaway. At certain events, officials would literally fling small tokens into the crowd, each marked with a prize. Anything from a loaf of bread to a live animal. And when I say live animal, I mean it. You could theoretically walk into the Colosseum with nothing but a snack and walk out leading a goat, a goose, or even a camel. Imagine navigating the narrow streets of Rome while your camel tries to eat your neighbor's laundry. Free food and drink were also common. Sometimes wine was distributed among the crowd, because nothing gets 50,000 people more in the mood for yelling than free alcohol. Bread, dried fruits, olives, and even roast meats might be handed out. Not just as a hospitality, but as a political move. Feed the people, entertain them, and they'll love you. Or at least be too full to riot. And then there were the more dramatic souvenirs. If you were close enough to the arena floor, you might get splashed by the blood of a fallen gladiator or animal, which, for some Romans, wasn't just a gross accident, but it was a lucky charm. Others might leave with discarded weapons, broken shields, or pieces of decorative armor that ended up in the crowd. It was part sport, part festival, part treasure hunt. Of course, all of this came with an unspoken rule. The bigger the emperor's generosity, the more he wanted your devotion in return. These freebies weren't just gifts. They were investments in loyalty. So when the emperor stood in his box and waved, you cheered a little louder. Not just because you'd had a good day at the games, but because there was a chance he might toss you the keys to a donkey on your next visit. The Colosseum wasn't just a place of spectacle. It was a political machine, a party, and a marketplace all rolled into one. And for the spectators, half the fun was never knowing if you'd leave with a story or a sheep. Of course, for all the bread, wine, and raffle camels, there was one thing every Roman spectator truly wanted from the Colosseum: a glimpse of their favorite gladiator. Because just like modern sports stars or movie idols, some fighters rose above the rest to become household names. These weren't just men with swords, they were walking legends. Their faces appeared on graffiti, painted on tavern walls, carved into lamps and cups. Women swooned over them, men placed bets on them, and children pretended to be them in the streets. Some were known for their unmatched skill, others for their sheer charisma, and a few simply for being so ridiculously good-looking that the crowd forgave them even when they lost. But celebrity in the arena came with its own strange perks and stranger dangers. Fame could win you adoring fans, luxurious gifts, and even secret love letters smuggled into the ludus. It could also earn you the envy of rivals, the attention of wealthy patrons, and the occasional death threat. Because in the Colosseum, the line between hero and target was as thin as the edge of a sword. So what was it really like to be one of these superstar gladiators, the ancient equivalent of a rock god, a sports champion, and a tabloid scandal all rolled into one? Let's step out of the stands, into the barracks, and into the strange, intoxicating world of Rome's most famous fighters. Being a famous gladiator in ancient Rome was a little like being a modern movie star, if movie stars had to dodge spears for a living. Once a fighter reached celebrity status, their life, well, it shifted, and dramatically so. The ludus, once just a place of sweat, bruises, and constant training, became part gym, part fan mail sorting center. Successful gladiators received gifts from admirers, jewelry, fine clothes, and sometimes even money. And not all gifts were some things that you'd want to unwrap. There are ancient records of women leaving locks of their hair or love charms in the barracks, hoping to win the heart of their favorite fighter. Essentially, gladiators were walking, sword-wielding heartthrobs. The most famous ones were often sponsored by wealthy patrons, the ancient Roman version of a brand deal. These patrons might cover living expenses, provide better armor, or even arrange for early retirement, all in exchange for the prestige of being associated with such a star. Some fighters had their own entourages, armor bearers, personal trainers, and even press agents in the form of friends spreading word of their latest victories around the city. Of course, fame did have its awkward side too. Imagine trying to enjoy a quiet drink in a tavern when half the customers are reenacting your last fight. And then there were the matter of gladiator groupies. Ancient writers complained, or bragged, about women of high rank falling hopelessly in love with fighters, even sneaking into the arena's training quarters at night. Some historians suggest this wasn't just lust. It was a certain rebellious thrill in mingling with men that society deemed dangerous and exotic. And while gladiators could be adored by the public, they were still legally considered infamous, people of low social standing, like actors or prostitutes. This meant that they couldn't hold public office or enjoy certain rights, no matter how many fans they had. It's like being an A-list celebrity who still isn't allowed into the VIP lounge. But still, for many, the perks outweigh the drawbacks. Fame could mean better fight matchups, easier opponents, and more mercy calls from the crowd if things tended to go badly. And for the lucky few who had survived long enough to retire, their fame often lingered. They could open training schools, live on their winnings, or just walk the streets knowing that somewhere, someone still had their face scratched into a tavern walls with the words, "The heartthrob of Rome." Being a celebrity gladiator wasn't just about winning fights. It was all about cultivating a persona, part warrior, part showman, part heartbreaker, and keeping the crowd hungry for more. And in a city where the games ruled the calendar, that meant your name could echo in the roar of the Colosseum long after you'd left. But of course, being a celebrity gladiator wasn't all roses, love letters, and free wine. Fame in ancient Rome came with a very sharp edge, sometimes literally. First off, rivalries were fierce. If another fighter thought you were hogging the spotlight, things could get ugly, fast. Training yard accidents happened. A wooden practice sword swung just a little too hard, or a sparring partner who forgot they weren't supposed to aim for your face. It was the ancient Roman equivalent of backstage drama on a reality show, except instead of passive-aggressive comments, it was bruises. Then there were the assassination attempts. Yep, some gladiators were actually targeted outside the arena. Maybe a rival's fan club didn't like that you beat their guy, Or maybe you accidentally offended a senator's wife who had your name carved on her wax tablet. Either way, you might find yourself avoiding dark alleys or anyone holding a suspiciously sharp fruit knife. And let's not forget the politics. Emperors and powerful patrons loved having famous gladiators on their side, not because they needed help in a sword fight, but because they wanted that sweet, sweet public approval. If the people loved you, you might be invited to mingle with the elite, attend lavish banquets, and pose for sculptures. The catch? You better clap loudly at the emperor's jokes and never outshine him in public. History doesn't record what happened to gladiators who made an emperor look bad, but let's just say they probably didn't get a great farewell party. Fame also brought a totally different kind of danger. Overzealous fans. Picture this. You're just trying to enjoy a quiet dinner of lentils and barley, when someone bursts in shouting, "Hey, you're the guy who took down that one guy in 2 rounds." Suddenly, you're reenacting your greatest hits with a salt shaker as a sword because saying no might lose you a fan, and possibly a future vote for mercy in the arena. So yes, celebrity gladiators had better food, better armor, and better chances of surviving a bad day in the Colosseum. But they also lived with the knowledge that the same crowd chanting your name could be chanting for your head tomorrow. It was like living in a world where your Instagram followers could literally kill you. And after years of dodging swords, surviving rivalries, and politely laughing at the emperor's jokes, some gladiators actually made it to the holy grail of the profession: retirement. In theory, this was the dream. If you fought bravely and often enough, or if you had the generous patron, you could be awarded Rudius, a simple wooden sword that symbolizes your freedom. The ceremony was emotional, the crowd cheered, your fellow fighters saluted, and you walked out of the arena knowing you'd never have to fight again. It was the ancient Roman equivalent of getting your gold watch after 30 years of service, except your service was repeatedly risking death for public entertainment. But here's the catch. Freedom didn't always mean happily ever after. For starters, being a retired gladiator in Rome was a little like being a washed-up rock star. Sure, people still recognized you, but the fan letters slowed down, the invitations to the lavish banquets mysteriously stopped arriving, and without the regular prize money and without the steady job lined up, many had to find work as bouncers, bodyguards, or trainers for the next generation of fighters. Some even chose to return to the arena because the pay was too addictive to give up. Imagine telling your friends you're done for good and then showing up back at work a month later with a new helmet. And then there were the practical problems. Gladiators were celebrities in the sand, but outside the arena, they were still infames, socially stigmatized, and legally limited. You might be free, but you couldn't just run for office, join the Senate, or marry into a respectable family. It was like Rome was saying, "Thanks for years of risking your life for our entertainment. Now please enjoy your permanent second-class status." Still, for many, retirement was a badge of honor. They'd survived the unthinkable, beaten the odds, and could spend their remaining years telling gloriously exaggerated stories about their one time fighting 3 men at once. Whether they ended up rich, broke, or somewhere in between, retired gladiators carried the aurora of the arena with them forever, proof that they'd lived, and lived loudly, in the heart of Rome's greatest spectacle. From the first day a recruit stepped into the ludus, with nothing but a wooden practice sword, to the roaring chaos of the Colosseum, to the quiet and sometimes complicated life of retirement, the journey of a gladiator was never just about blood and sand. It was about survival, skill, and spectacle. It was about the clash of steel echoing under a Roman sun, the scent of dust and sweat mixing with the perfume of the crowd. It was about the strange contradictions, the warriors who were slaves and yet adored like gods, the deadly duels that sometimes ended in mercy, the emperors who ruled an empire and still caved the thrill of the fight. These men, and sometimes women, lived in a world where every match was a gamble, every cheer could turn into a jeer, and every victory might be the one they'd be remembered for, or the last they'd ever see. They were athletes, actors, and survivors, wrapped in armor and myth. And whether they fell young in the arena or walked away holding the wooden sword of freedom, they carried something no one could take from them, a place in the stories Rome would tell for centuries. The Colosseum still stands, its stones weathered and scarred, a silent witness to all the lives that played out within its walls. And if you stand there today, you can almost hear it, the distant roar of the crowd, the clash of the blades, and the heartbeat of a city that once lived for the games. Because in ancient Rome, the gladiator was more than a fighter. They were the embodiment of the empire's hunger for drama, glory, and the thin, dangerous line between life and death. And that is why their legend still lives, long after the sand has settled. Thanks for listening to this video. If you enjoyed this story, please click the like icon and subscribe to my channel. I hope you're long asleep, but if not, I'll feed the fire a little bit longer, hoping the slow, crackling sounds of the burning embers will put you to sleep. See you guys in the next video. Bye.